to this month's meetup. We have this wonderful presentation, how to get your tech startup taken seriously by a big company. We have an exceptional speaker this month, Tammy Hepps. She is the CTO of iVillage, which is one of the 50 largest high-traffic websites in the world. She's formerly the Director of Technology for both the NewYorkTimes.com and Barnes Noble SparkNotes, as well as the VP of Technology for a joint venture between Dow Jones and IAC. And without further ado, Tammy Hepps.
Thanks. So thank you to Eric and to the various meetups, especially the NYC MySQL meetup, for inviting me. Can everyone hear me? Do I need the mic more? Oh, good. Great. Eric told you a bit about my background, primarily corporate. I have a couple of startup experiences, where I was most recently being a joint venture startup between two big companies, so kind of startup, kind of not. And SparkNotes was a startup before we ultimately got acquired by Barnes Noble. So though I have some sort of experience, I've been pitched to a lot more than I've done pitches. So, you know, especially at the New York Times, and you'd be amazed how many just in the few months that I've been at iVillage, you know, have been approached by lots of different people, you know, how can we, you know, do business together. I don't get a lot overall. You know, in a really busy month, I might get one or two things emailed to me. If I go to an event like this, you know, I end up meeting a lot more people, but just in terms of cold calls, my volume is pretty low. But for the business development people within the companies that I've worked at, who this is their job to, you know, find partnerships, you know, as we'll talk about later in the presentation, they get a really large volume of these kinds of requests coming in. What I mostly get are people saying, I have a startup idea, how do I build it, who can I talk to, who do you know? So it's a completely other issue from what we're talking about here. So my personal business development experience is more in terms of supporting the business development function within the companies where I work. So in terms of preparing this presentation, certainly reflected on my own presentation, attending pitches made by, you know, people like you and others. Also consulted with a bunch of business development leads at the various big companies that I've worked at through NBC and the New York Times and a couple of other places to make sure that the perspective I was giving you is not just of the CTO who's going to vet how your technology may or may not be a fit, but also for the business person who's going to vet the overall credentials of your company. And I'll admit that we had a lot of fun putting the presentation together. You know, we started off venting about, you know, the cold calls that are annoying, the people who are pushy. But I hope that I've kind of turned those kinds of things into constructive advice for all of you so that you can be the kind of person who's pitching and gets a lot of respect rather than being the kind of person who's pitching and, you know, the company's trying to figure out how to gently tell you no. So it seems like this is a great turnout. So obviously, you know, there are a lot of you who are here because you want to know what's the secret. How do you get your tech startup taken seriously by a big company? I would assume that for many of you, the idea is that if you can get the partnership with a big company, in some way it will validate your startup, it will make your future growth a lot easier. But as those of you who've tried to do this may have noticed, the big company doesn't always want to give you the time of day. So first I want to talk a bit about what are you up against? Why is this such a challenge in the first place? So what makes a big company so challenging? First of all, as I talked about before, they're a magnet for requests. The BD people that I talk to could see 2 to 5 requests per week. In a busy week, they could see 10. So that's already the volume of people who are vying for your attention just to get your initial email read or your phone message listened to. The people who are there to take these messages are very busy. They have existing responsibilities that keep them more than 100% engaged besides, you know, engaging with you and reaching out. Also, something that I'd like to point out is that for as much as you think that being part of a big company gives you a lot of resources and makes things easier, it also can create a lot of significant overhead for these kinds of partnerships. And for those of you guys who are in startups and had corporate experience before, this may be exactly why you left the corporate world. A lot of teams need to vet the idea. You know, I threw a bunch up here. Plenty more than this. It really depends what the deal is and how high up the chain it would go. There is a lot of legal work involved. Just to get an NDA signed could sometimes take a few weeks, just so that we can talk to you and hear about your idea and you can feel comfortable with it. And it's never easy just to try it out. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. In terms of strategy, in terms of budget planning, in terms of the fact that big companies tend to have older technology, these are all things that make the company pretty inflexible to deal with sometimes. And the last one is that in general, big companies can be pretty risk averse. They may want to do a deal with you to get a press release that shows them as being really cutting edge. But on the flip side, they don't want to do bad deals. So there's always this space where they're trying to figure out, are you the person who's going to make them look hip and cool? Or are you the startup that's going to completely flame out and they've wasted a lot of time and money trying to do something with you? So in terms of what's in this talk and what's not in this talk, we'll go through a few different points. First of all, how to present your company's story in the best possible light. I'll try to give you some thinking about, business development people or people like me who are, looking at the background of your company. What are the kinds of things that would make us more inclined to take you seriously or less inclined? We'll also talk a bit about how to understand what that particular company is looking for. Then how do you actually put all that information together and approach the company in a way where they'll pay attention and take you seriously. We'll talk about what you should include or not include in those initial conversations. And then we'll end by sort of playing devil's advocate. Do you really want to take your company in this direction? Is this really A, the right time, or B, the right direction for you to be setting up these kinds of partnerships? What this talk isn't about is about getting acquired. It's about doing business with the big company, about figuring out how you can set up a strategic partnership that will benefit the big company and benefit you. Working with corporate planning and investing is a completely different process. It kind of starts off the same in trying to get noticed and then veers off very differently. You'll see we'll be talking a lot about integration issues. You wouldn't be dealing with that if you're trying to get acquired or just get some kind of investment. Also, the scope of this talk only goes through that initial meeting. If you can get that face-to-face meeting where you're pitching in person, it doesn't go beyond that. And also say that I don't mind questions as I go, so feel free to interrupt if at any point something is less than clear or you want some clarification before I move on. So, preparing your company's story, part one. Before you approach the big company, you ought to know how they're going to perceive you so you can figure out, which things to highlight and which things not. We'll talk about which elements of the story are almost mandatory for a big company to take you seriously, and if you don't have them, what are your options? The good news is that a lot of what it means to impress a big company is the same as impressing a potential investor, whether a VC or an individual. It's the same thing that you would tell recruits that you're trying to hire to be a part of your team. The same thing you would tell any partner, not just a big company. So a lot of what we're going to go through in this section, it's things that you probably already know. So here's what you should prepare to present and also know how to spin. But first of all, there's something that you should keep in mind all the way, and that's the herd mentality of big companies. So we all know people trust the opinions of people and institutions they respect. You tell me you went to a good school and I'll already make nice assumptions about you before I find out otherwise. I meet you and a friend tells me nice things about you, likewise I'm inclined to give you the benefit of the doubt. And it's no different when you're approaching a company. In the initial approach, the company doesn't have time or interest to vet you fully. So they're going to be relying on the judgments of others, especially companies like theirs. So some of these first few slides are, how can you say that other people whose opinions the company would trust have already gone through the job of vetting you and have found you to be somebody worth doing business with. Obviously, if you go further down the road, the big company is going to do all of that work itself, but you're not going to have that time initially. So first of all, establishing your backers. Who are you backed by? This is a really great way to be able to show a company that reputable people have taken you seriously. Say you're funded by one of the top VCs and, already you're in the door. In fact, one of the reasons to partner with a big venture capital company is, in fact, they will probably get you in the door. They will help identify who you should be talking to and make those connections. So, separate issue about investments, but, it's an important part of your story. The second one, obviously, being how much funding do you have? Not only because in some ways there's this perception that the amount of funding you get, correlates to the quality of your idea, which isn't always true, but that's the perception. More importantly, the big company doesn't want to do a deal with you and then have you run out of money, because that's a waste of everyone's time. So what do you do if you don't have backing? Well, you tell a story about how you've accomplished a lot with very little. You're smart people, you've worked really hard, you've put it together. So, although this is one of the most important pieces, I wouldn't say it's a showstopper. But you need a way of being able to spin it, that here's what's special about you guys as individuals. Here's why you didn't need to take any money to support it, because your idea is just that great that your startup costs are minimal, and therefore your road to profitability is that much easier. Beyond your backers, this is an important one. Who are your current partners? We'll talk a lot later about whether you should be starting with your first partnership or an early partnership being a big company. But the big company or any company is going to want to know who's already working with you, because it says that someone like them already went through the whole process and liked you. So what if you don't have any partners? I would say that's probably one of the points that's going to be tough for you to overcome. The big company is going to wonder if you're shooting too high or trying to grow too fast. Look, if you have good financials, a really good team, really good backing, that's certainly overcomeable, because a startup of that caliber, people expect to, get in the door of a lot of places and set those partnerships from the start. Otherwise, the opportunity for you to spin it is to convince the company of the opportunity, and hopefully, try to convince them that they should become an anchor partner to you so that they can beat out the competition. So, again, another point where, it can be a major hindrance if you don't have the right level of partnerships in place, but there's an opportunity to spin it that the company may or may not buy. Finally, partners show whether or not you have enough experience to work effectively with a company. There's a learning process when you're working with a company, figuring out how a completely different group of people do business, integrate with a product, and so on. And if you've gone through that with somebody else, then it'll likely be a lot easier when you're approaching me and my team in order to do that integration. I can give you an example of a company. It's a fairly new content site that some of you might be familiar with. They did all of their early syndication deals with major media websites. And the reason why was because they had content that was just that compelling and that nobody else had. So they literally came in with a product that was that great where, despite the fact that they were literally starting as high as you could get, the people they were approaching did in fact want the product. So it is overcomeable to have no partners, but you're going to have strengths in other areas as well. Next, of course, who's on your team? A lot of this stuff is a no-brainer. We all know the kinds of things that impress, people about other people. Not only the management team, especially, what their track record is, especially if they have experience working on sort of the corporate side of, whatever the startup space is that you're in, but also in terms of your team. We'll talk a bit more about growth of the team in a moment, but, overall, what skill set do you have together? And also, it may come up, which business functions are you handling in-house versus with external partners? What expertise do you have versus where are you relying on others? If your core offering is technology and you have people out of house building the technology, that may make somebody like me a little bit squeamish that, you're trying to sell me something that you may not necessarily entirely understand yourselves. So beyond tricking the big company into being impressed by you because others are impressed by you, you also will need to show off what your company has accomplished to date. So first of all, your financials. What is your business model? You must have one. Now, I know we all know a lot of startups that don't have business models, and they're some of the darlings of the internet these days, and everybody wonders, how are they going to make money? But, the truth is, if you're not already one of those darlings, the big company isn't going to assume that you're going to become one. So you need to have one. Figure out some way of how you're going to monetize this cool thing that you're putting together. And again, when it gets to that level of the conversation, it's not enough just to say that you have one. You should show clear metrics where, someone like me, someone like on the business side can sort of validate your math and say, okay, this could work. If they sell this many of X at this price, I see how this is going to work. You should also be prepared to present your financials to date. How much are you spending versus how much is your revenue growing? And also be able to forecast when you're going to be profitable. Again, I wouldn't say that these things are showstoppers, but they're things that could, if not in good order, create risk in the mind of the big company who would be taking a risk on you. So, what it all comes down to, as I said before, is we need to know that you're going to stay in business for the life of the deal. Financials get to the trajectory of the company. First of all, stability of the business model. I think we all know lots of startups that start out B2C, there's no money there, they go B2B, that doesn't quite work, they change their product, they try again. A big company doesn't want to kind of be stuck in the middle of all of that. So they're going to want to know, whatever it is that you're offering, how long you've been offering it, and has it been offered long enough for you to prove that this is what you're going to keep doing. We talked about the size of the teams and your plan for growing it out, and just your general plans for expanding the business. Press mentions and awards are always nice. If you've won a prestigious award like the TechCrunch 50, that's always a nice one to tout. Wouldn't waste time touting ones that aren't that prestigious, although congratulations to get noticed anywhere. And overall, a question will come up of what phase of the business are you in. If you're still in the ideation phase, you definitely are not ready to be approaching a company for a partnership yet. But are you still researching? Have you started up? Are you in the early stage of your startup? You need to be able to articulate that to the company, and obviously the more mature that you are, the less risk the company will see. And finally, you need to know your competitive set. You obviously, in terms of doing the research to put your company together in the first place, you know which companies do things that are similar to you. So you should be able to articulate why are you different and why are you better. Because you can imagine if they're taking the time to talk to you, they're probably looking at your competitors as well and thinking, well, here's this young company that does something. I'd rather take the more mature company that does almost the same thing. So, you need to be able to sell your differentials on that. If you really don't have any competitors, if really what you're doing is something that new and novel, you need to be able to explain that, especially to a non-technical audience. Likely the first person you're going to speak to is not going to be the CTO of the company, but it's likely to be a business development person who does this vetting. Some are very technical. The guys I work with now are great. Some are a lot less technical. I've seen both. So you should be able to know how to articulate that to somebody who may not necessarily even have the basic vocabulary. And also, given the space in which we're operating, if they're open source or free alternatives, you need to tell someone like me why I shouldn't just take the free alternative, why I should be paying you for something. I can give you an example of one widget company that I worked with a couple sites ago. They weren't the most mature ones. They weren't necessarily the best competitor, but they had the ability to customize the look and feel of their widgets in a much more extensive way than any of their competitors. And they were able to bring that out in their presentation. They were able to show, here are all of the different ways in which you can do the customization. Here's exactly how we can tailor it to your site. So in their case, it was really only that difference that got them the partnership, as opposed to all of the other 100 people who are providing platforms for developing widgets. So those are the different aspects of your story that you should review. And as I said before, figure out how to spin, positive or negative. So, as discussed, there are a few things that can make the big company hesitant to partner with you. But fortunately, the backstory is only part of the picture that you're going to be painting. Beyond just knowing about you, what is the company looking for? So all of that backstory is in order to enable a company to decide, can you operate at the necessary level? First of all, what's the maturity of your offering, whether it's the scope, stability, or completeness of the feature set? What's the uptime that you're able to achieve, if that's an applicable metric to what you're doing? What's your ability to scale, if whether on the business or literally on the server level, depending upon what your model is? What kind of support team do you already in place? Do you even have a support team for integrating with partners? Do you have an existing user base? There are lots of other metrics like that, but they want to see, they want to get a sense that your offering is mature enough to get into a long-term deal with. They also want to know that you have the ability to execute. Are you going to be able to hit the dates and the costs that you're committing to? Or are you going to run late, or are there going to be extraordinary cost overruns? And that looks bad in any company, and especially bad in a big company with really tight financials. Can you create the right kind of flexible solution? Can you address concerns like security and privacy, where it's one thing to screw up when you're a small company, but if you screw up and you have a big brand like NBC, it's all over the headlines. It's the worst possible thing that can happen. Can you provide the right kind of reporting metrics that the company is going to be able to need to report on the success or failure of the integration? And just in general, are you going to provide top quality in everything, or are you going to be struggling to deliver? But your company's ability to operate effectively is one thing. But there's one thing which we haven't spoken about at all yet, which is really the heart of this presentation. And that's, what's your product, and how can you improve their business? So you need to know, first of all, what is the problem that you would be solving for a business? There are kind of a larger set of problems that you can solve in the world that aren't on this list, and many of them mean that you don't need to partner with a big company at all. You want to go directly to consumers. But in the case of approaching a big company, you want to know that you're either going to be giving them more money, more traffic, better traffic, helping them get things done faster, helping their site perform better, or the sort of catch-all of brand differentiation. So coming in there and just saying, hey, we're this new startup, we're cool and we're cutting edge, it isn't enough. So use that catch-all of brand differentiation. If really you don't know where else you fit, tell them that something about doing this innovative partnership with you is going to make them look cooler than their competitors. But you need to be able to know how to articulate that in a way that's going to resonate with people on the business side, who, as we talked about before, are going to be a little bit, unsure about whether they want to take a big risk with something too cutting edge. I also made a note here that you want to do one thing good without negatively impacting the others. I've seen lots and lots and lots of analytics solutions which throw JavaScript on the front end of the site, which on the one hand is great, you pull fabulous numbers. On the other hand, it slows down the client-side performance of the pages, so it's a non-starter. Another example is, you see a lot of really great ad solutions that completely detract from the content, and then your user engagement goes down because users see these totally offensive ads and they go elsewhere. So you can pick the one that you're good at, but you need to know how you might be affecting the others. Because if you're not going to know the answers, the big company is certainly going to be asking the questions. And to the heart of it, this part should be easy. This is the part that you probably did the most thinking about when you were starting the business, when you came up with the idea in the first place. And that's, what exactly are you offering? And a really important point here, which I'm going to make a few times, is you need to have an actual product or service ready, whether it's content, whether it's a technical solution, whether it's a feature in between. You'd be amazed at the number of times that people send emails to the highest level of big companies saying, I'd love to talk about how we can work together. Nobody wants to talk about how they can work with you unless you're somebody with either a really proven track record or amazing backing or any of those other things that we talked about previously. And they're also not going to sit and brainstorm with you about possibilities. As we'll talk about later, you need to be brainstorming those possibilities. You need to be driving that conversation. I know it sounds a little bit cynical, but those are exactly the kinds of emails that a person's going to read and say, I don't have time for this. If they don't know exactly what they want to do, what the opportunity is, that person isn't going to take the time to do it for you. So you need to know from that previous slide which tangible benefit you're providing, and also know how you're going to be able to quantify that benefit. Metrics, very important. And the last one I would say is, to use a term that I learned elsewhere, but what special sauce does your product have that the company needs to get from you versus building themselves? And that's another important point, and it's also something that is probably one of my primary considerations when I'm vetting companies. Why would I take it from you if I can just build it myself? In a lot of cases, I probably have a bigger technology team than you do, a more seasoned team. I probably know really well exactly how long it's going to take me to get things done, what my resources and availability is to get it done. So you need to tell me why it is that I can't just say, great, thanks for the idea, and go and build some version of that myself. In terms of putting together the story for what you're offering, you need to know how to tell it clearly and concisely. And also, as we'll talk about, in a way that accommodates for your audience's biases, what they know and also what they don't know. So the next few slides are going to start getting into some technical detail about the product that you're building. So obviously, not all the issues apply to every startup. In fact, if your startup is kind of on a less technical end, maybe none of these things necessarily apply. And based on the level of integration, as we'll talk about, you'll be judged differently on different criteria. The deeper the integration, the more that someone like me is going to expect of your ability to do that technology. So, as you read through it, figure out which ones apply to you, and also the ones that don't, probably don't. This isn't meant to, obviously, cover every situation. So first of all, how is it built? I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. I could give an entirely separate presentation about how to develop a good software product, but all the kinds of considerations that you guys were going through when you were figuring out how to assemble your technology team and get the thing built. What technologies, what delivery model, how are you going to support it, how can you customize it for different customers, how are you going to scale it, how cutting edge, and so on and so on and so on. The more technical solution, the better you need to be here, which is to say if you're delivering me a feed of content, as long as you can deliver me the one-time dump of XML and it's well formatted and I can parse it, then I don't really care that somebody in India wrote the XML by hand to compose it. But if there's going to be a really deep integration, then you're going to get a lot more questions about how exactly you're doing things here. And again, so you need to know how the integration will work. And this could be a whole presentation in itself as well. How do you take your software but put it in a way that it's actually deliverable? Before you approach the company, you need to consider in advance the way that the partner is going to make use of your product. And, again, this list isn't exhaustive, but it will give you a range of possibilities, loosely increasing in complexity. In most cases, even the least technical business development guy knows what these are. So when you say, all you do is drop a line of JavaScript, they're probably not going to believe you because a lot of other people say that too, but they'll know what level of complexity you're talking about versus, building out a hosted platform. It's maybe tough because your solution may already be in place. And so you may have already chosen the route that has the most hurdles. But good for you to consider, what are all the possibilities and where in the spectrum does that put you? You can start simply by cross-linking. They, link off your site to your site, or they can embed your widget, which then goes off-site. You could deliver to us a feed, or we could deliver to you a feed that you do something with, or we could be taking a feed from you. There's the sort of famous, it's just a line of JavaScript, which I already poked a little bit of fun at, an iframe solution. And then you get into the heftier ones, like I'm actually integrating your software into my application, or literally installing your application in my environment. Whether you have a platform where I'm using your API to interact with it, whether you're building an application for me, whether I'm building an application for you that interacts, and then finally where you have a hosted application that interacts with my single sign-on solution. And there are lots of others in between here. The list isn't meant to be exhaustive, but it kind of gives you a sense of what your integration possibilities must be. And as I said before, you need to know how you're going to integrate. Because as soon as you say you have a great product and it's built and it's fabulous, what's next? You need to know what's going to come next, which people are going to need to be involved on each side, what kind of skills they need to have, what kind of time is going to need to be involved. So, to give you a couple of examples here of how these things can be stumbling blocks, actually pretty recently a pretty solid seeming company approached me about providing a solution for site optimization, but it involved there being a pass-through for all of our traffic. Literally, they would sit in front of our site and make some kind of decision about how to serve pages. And from my perspective as CTO, there's no way that I'm going to let a young company sit in front of my website and handle all of my traffic. So, they actually did, I think, have that special sauce, so it made it a difficult call to make. But, at the end of the day, that kind of solution for a young company that still hasn't proven its ability to scout a lot of traffic, that was the end of the conversation there. I can give you a different story, though, going much further back. I did an integration with an online service that was literally looking for its first partner. Nothing about its team or its backing was particularly impressive. The competitors were all bigger, really, really established brands. But they were the only one who provided the service in a way that could actually integrate with my website. Let alone a website at all, but in a way that I could really integrate in a straightforward way. And that's why they got the partnership, and I can't say that I didn't lose sleep over that one because it was kind of taking a risk. But the risk paid off because the fact that they knew how to sort of package it and deliver it so that we could integrate it also showed that they clearly got the space that they were operating in, and then in every step of the way, actually, what they executed on was at just as high a level as the way they were able to do the integration in the first place. So there's a case where just having packaged their product properly got them the business, and none of the other bigger, more established brands where they would have been more of a known commodity. So these are just some general ideas about how to properly define your product for an external company. But that's any external company. Now I want to turn to the subject of the company that you're targeting, the company which brand you identified and you thought, if only I can get my content on the New York Times, if only I can get my widget on iVillage, those kinds of companies that you feel are sort of the big markers for success. So how do you tailor your pitch to the company? We talked about the great company, we talked about the great product that you have, but this is really the last piece. It's also probably the trickiest because everything we've gone through before, you already know the answers. They're within you and your company. And when the answers are not quite what you want them to be, you can either go back and do a bit more work before you ready yourself for the pitch, or you can figure out how to spin it. But when you're dealing with another company, they are what they are. First of all, you don't necessarily are going to have you're not necessarily going to have a great way of figuring out exactly what they're looking for, exactly what their biases are. And also, you can't change the way that they do things. So if the first thing you hear about their platform is that it's just not going to integrate with yours, there's not a lot you can do about that. So the first issue here is knowing the company. And the truth is a lot of this is a combination of common sense and research. Whether you should be looking at press releases about that company, what initiatives is it's doing, what new partnerships has it recently announced. Is it hiring? Is it laying off? What news are people writing about it? Is it viewed favorably or unfavorably by other people, and why? And also try to find people who work there and talk to them and try to figure out what's going on internally that may mean that there's an opportunity for you. It seems like a lot of work, but if this is such a key partnership for you, then this is groundwork that you need to do. I know when you're pitching to 50 different potential places, then it begins to get to a lot of work. But as we'll talk about later, it will pay off when you're able to write a pitch email that's actually a lot more directed. So in terms of about the company, whether it's the general landscape for companies like theirs, I think we all know what's happening to media companies, for example, what competitive pressures they have from other people who are getting more notice or less notice than they are. And also, individual challenges. For example, at a media company laying off editors, which I think we all read about all the time, you could guess, for example, that they would be interested in solutions that can, where algorithms do the work of editors. If you provide a solution like that, whether it's, a recommendation engine or something more than that, you can imagine that even if they're not talking about it, they'd be interested in knowing how can you overcome the fact that they just laid off half their editorial staff. Another important point here is that you can also interpret the company's challenges so you can guess at problems that they don't really know that they have. Probably one of the only cases where I actually paid for a workflow tool rather than using an open source alternative was a company that had a really, really, really cool rapid prototyping tool. We didn't know that we needed one, but they guessed correctly that a team of our size, of people with different capacities, would probably benefit from it. And so literally their pitch had us all salivating about how fabulously we could all work together if only we had this tool where we could, instead of getting requirements, prototype what is the site that we want to build. So in that case, they guessed that we would have this problem, and they were dead on. In terms of interpreting, another case that I could give you is I see lots of companies that show me how to monetize users in ways that I didn't actually know that I could segment and monetize. Again, I know I want to make more money. I didn't know that I could make more money in that way. As we spoke about before, you want to be able to brainstorm specific ways that your product can help the company. If you're delivering a certain kind of content, know exactly where it would fit in the site that it aligns with their editorial vision. If it's more of a deeper integration with an application, know why their users would want to do it. Why would they actually take the time to use that particular application, store that data in that particular manner, or whatever it may be. I will also say it's just not enough to pick a bullet from the earlier list and say, oh, we'll increase your engagement. Say something like, we'll increase your engagement on visits referred from search by tailoring the page to, the user's search terms. It's also not enough to say, oh, we have a great A/B testing platform. That's generic. There are lots of A/B testing platforms. Say, our A/B testing platform actually will work with your existing Ajax page components. Looking at your homepage, we can see that we can actually test the different tabs of your homepage or rotate the different stories in your top carousel. The more specific that you can be, the more that you can say that you actually took the time to look at, the company's, website or whatever their product offering is to know where you're going to integrate with it, the better long run. And the last point I'll say is the person that you're contacting is very likely not the person who's setting strategy. They're the one who's responding to it. So you need to kind of intuit what the company's strategy is to show how you align with what's already there. You're very unlikely to walk into a company and shift what it is that they were already planning to do. We talked about before, big companies are, like ships. They're very hard to steer. You're not going to be the one to steer them. So, even if you are trying to get them to move, show how it fits, in some core way with what they're doing and will help them advance. You also should know what the company's existing partnerships are. You should be able to figure out a good sense of what are they doing with partners versus what do they do in-house. It gets back to the sort of not built here syndrome that I was talking a bit about before, where my bias is, if I can just build it myself, why would I buy it from you? So you should have a general sense. There's some sites that do lots and lots of partnerships. iVillage, for example, is a great example of that. There's some sites that do very little of those, and so it changes what you would be pitching to and what the opportunity is there. You should also, in terms of looking at the site, know how deeply partners are integrated versus called out separately. The New York Times, for example, is a really great example of a site where you can't necessarily tell when you're looking at a page that's actually being delivered by a partner. If you click around and watch the URLs, you kind of need to know where to go, but you'll see places where all of a sudden the domain changes and it's not from the Times anymore, but you would never know. The New York Times has an entire prepackaged partner shell and single sign-on integration that they know how to deliver to partners and do that all the time. But they'll never create a site experience where it doesn't fit within their larger look and feel. So whether it's visual differentiation, whether it's the presence or absence of attribution, again, you're not going to see a lot of places on the Times where there's a logo that says powered by somebody who's not the New York Times. And also, as I said before, whether they're linking to offsite or whether it's that experience, which one of those do they do? And know how to respond if yours is a different model. And of course, you need to know if there are existing partnerships that are competitive to you. If I've already signed a 2-year deal to get sports scores from a stats website, kind of stuck. Yours may be better, but I signed a 2-year deal. So you should have a sense of that as well. So next up is actually getting the company's attention, which I think is what you all wanted to get to. I think to some extent the things that I've been saying about how to tell your company's story, whether it's to articulate your product, how to understand the company that you want to pitch to, all of that is just groundwork for how you're actually going to get the company's attention, which is, of course, the heart of it. And I think you're all hoping that I have some kind of magic formula here about how you're the ones who can get through the 10 emails a week. And I see some faces lighting up, and I fear I may disappoint, but I'll tell you the honest truth, which is the best that I can do. But so the first thing that you need to know when you're approaching a big company is they probably don't want to hear from you. the working assumption, and it's not your fault, but imagine all that they're seeing, is that this particular lead isn't going to have any value. The idea may be good, but the execution may not be good. The execution may be really good, but we're not so sure that the company is viable. It may have all of the above, but it just isn't a fit. And it may have all of the above and it's fabulous, but we just don't actually have the time to do the deal with you. So, you can sort of imagine a funnel where, very few of the, the emails and calls and introductions that we're getting actually get down to a company where, yeah, we want to take the time to talk to you and learn more about what you're offering. It has nothing to do with you or your company necessarily, but just, the general impression is there are lots of people who are sending the let's brainstorm together emails, and that's the noise that you need to find a way of getting through. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, the people who are vetting these, whether it's someone on the BD side, whether it's someone like me, whether it's the editorial lead, if you're, providing content, whatever it may be, we're people who are very busy, and again, we're kind of assuming that you're not going to benefit us, and I hesitate to say this because I hope to meet many of you afterwards, and you're all going to assume I'm looking at you askew, and I'm not, but, the general assumption is, show me why this is going to be great. Kind of a side note about, the RFP process. You're not going to see anything in any of the feature slides about the RFP process, and that's really because most companies don't do, at this size, they don't do a public RFP process. There isn't a way for you to find out what are they actually looking for, so that if we're looking for a community platform, you can say, hey, wait a minute, look at my new community platform. And it's mostly because, whether it's on the business development side or the product side or the technology side, we kind of already know, based on our research, who are the major players in a space, who do we want to do business with, who are the friends of our boss that we have to talk to, even though it's a waste of time. So that's going to be the tough thing for you. But I will say, there's a benefit for people internally to get to know you, even if the time isn't right. So whatever point that they may actually be looking for a partner, that they could think, oh, I spoke to this guy and he had this cool product, and maybe I should reach out to him and or her and see what the opportunity is. So we'll talk about what the steps are. A lot of them are going to end in no further action, but there's always value in just making sure that people get to know you, because in most cases, the deal, the partnership is going to come out of their contacting you rather than you're contacting them. So the first thing is that you need to find someone internal to advocate for you, and I think you guys already know this, so I'm not going to belabor the point. If you find the right person, if you can get right to the the heart of the decision maker, then that's the best chance that you have of being noticed. In most cases, the business development lead is your ideal choice. That's their job, to bring people like you to the company's attention and say, what do you think about this? Unless, of course, if it's, as I said before, if it's content, the editorial director, or if it's technology, someone like me, if it's an advertising solution, the head of ad ops, whatever it may be. And I think, you guys for individual companies should kind of know who's the ideal person who could look at what you're doing and then get immediately, whoa, this is the person who can understand. You also want to avoid finding someone who's so senior that they're not going to take your call, or so senior that when they drop down 3 levels and tell the business development person that they must take your call, that the business development person would be a little bit ruffled. So be careful about that one. And obviously, don't find someone who's so low that they're useless. Your sister's friend who just graduated from college who works in editorial. That's great, and she probably actually can answer a lot of your questions about what the company's doing, but she's probably not going to, get you in the door of the higher-ups who are making the decisions. So, the question is, what if you can't find the right person? Which, is a challenge for all of us at all levels. There are companies that I want to do business with that, I can't necessarily get a hold of the right person to say, come on, don't you want to provide this technology for iVillage? So, for you guys, if you can't find the right person, then again, it's sort of the quality of that cold call pitch. It's your company's story. It's the quality of your approach. It's the quality of your product. It's the ideas that you're proposing in the email that you're sending. That's all that you have to rely on. And the one thing that I will say before we kind of start going through what are the steps for contacting is, when you make a contact and a person is engaging with you, don't go around their back and find somebody else, because that's the kind of thing that just comes off as pushy. General advice for life, but it's the kind of thing that would, rub somebody the wrong way. If they're going to say no to you, don't go find their boss and make them say yes. It's only going to make people predisposed to not wanting to pursue the relationship, even if there really is an opportunity. So, find the right person. So here are the recommended steps to contact, and I think there are probably lots of ideas on this one. This was pulled together by talking to a bunch of BD people and saying, what is a reasonable approach that you'll have the time to deal with, the time to vet, and doesn't go in to rub you the wrong way. So recommended steps to contact. First of all, start with an email. Don't start with a phone call. Send an email with a succinct pitch, specific pitch, with a clear opportunity. It's tied to the company's need. And at this point, just the highlights of your background, anything that sort of, the couple bullet points that would sound tremendously impressive. Some of the things that we talked about earlier, whether it's, the quality of your backers or your teams, where somebody would read immediately and say, okay, I'll take these people seriously. If you don't get a reply to your email, the sort of group recommendation of the people that I spoke to is wait a couple weeks and then, make a follow-up phone call. Now, if you don't get a reply to the email, or they don't get a reply to the phone call, or you do in fact take a phone call, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but it doesn't lead to further discussions, the sort of group advice was that you should be waiting about 6 months or until you have something new to say. So 6 months may seem like a long time because things move really quickly in the world of a startup. Things move a lot more slowly in the world of a company. So if they're saying to you, we're too busy now, or a company like mine where we're in the process of relaunching the entire site, I'm still going to be finishing the relaunch of the site 6 months from now. So our ability to do partnerships isn't actually going to materially change until that amount of time later. But really, you can reach out sooner if you have something new to say. In other words, if they give you feedback of, we're not interested in your particular offering, try to figure out why. What are you doing that makes your offering broader than it was before that they might be interested in? Or, or whatever it may be. And a categorical no is a categorical no. I wouldn't think it's a no, but maybe you'll get a yes later. Again, if your story materially changes, that's one thing, but otherwise I would say focus your energy elsewhere. Don't hope for miracles. One side note on that important point that I said earlier about being specific. You may be kind of the rare case of somebody who could go and say, we have this amazing product, we should figure it out. Again, I wouldn't advise it, but I can say that when I was at the Times, we did get involved in one in-depth, how can we work together conversation with a website that was, the darling of that, particular year in the internet. And everyone internally wanted to make it happen, but the reason why it never really came to amount to anything was entirely on the side of the company that approached us. We were totally willing to brainstorm with them, but they never actually got it to the point of specific ideation. And without specific ideation, it just kind of lost steam internally on our side, and it didn't end up going anywhere. So, there's a second level reason why, being specific matters. Even if they will, miracle of miracles, brainstorm with you, if there isn't something that's particularly actionable, it's going to fizzle. So here's some advice that I can offer you for emails. Again, I'm not going to belabor the point. Send a specific proposal. Don't ask for an exploratory conversation. I think I gave you some caveats around that. Tell the company clearly how your product will benefit them, and tie it to the goals that We've gone through all of this. Provide links, if available, that demo your product in action. If you have an existing partnership, check out this website where my widget is integrated, and try it out here, or see how we skinned it and it fits very nicely on their look and feel, or whatever it may be that shows it off. Are they actually going to click on the links? I don't really know how often that they might or might not. But just the fact that the link is there and it's in action already, sort of suggests that you are, further along. And I'd also say, I know we talked a lot about the background of your company, but at this stage they don't want to hear about the details of your company, so I'd only just drop in the most flattering details rather than 3 paragraphs of all your amazing experience to date. Don't send a generic pitch. I want something that's going to be specific about my company. I don't want to read the same pitch that you sent to 10 different people. Send. And in terms of the known goals. Some of the best emails that I've seen are a case where, it's a recommendation engine, and they also include a screenshot of where, actually here's a place on my site where the links are not showing the right content, and here's where they could show, much better, more highly relevant content. Or, in the case of database mining, tell me exactly, knowing my audience, being able to research it in some of the publicly available tools, what kinds of demographics would you be able to tell me about my users that I don't already know? In terms of phone calls, have a real conversation, not a sales pitch. I know when you're pitching, you spend a lot of time figuring out, how do you want to present things, what wording do you want to use. But again, it feels that way. It feels generic. It feels unprepared to, people on the receiving end. So have a real conversation. If you send a PowerPoint first, which a lot of people do, don't assume that the person has read it. You can, very politely say at the beginning, I'm going to assume you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, so let's walk through it together. And if in fact they have, then be very, very, very pleasantly surprised that they took the time to do it, because that doesn't seem to happen that often based on the people that I spoke to. I would also say, don't use a canned PowerPoint. Use screenshots, include my branding, show me how the product's going to integrate, kind of like what we were talking about doing in the email, but, the next step up. Talking to the BD people that I know, they don't like WebExes. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do one. It just means that you should consider whether it is the best and most effective way for you to demonstrate your product. If your product is something about a tool that people are using, it may be really, really hard to get across in screenshots what the interaction is. In which case, you probably want to take the risk that they won't be so turned off about having to devote half an hour to staring at only your thing on the computer screen. But if there's a way with, nicely chosen screenshots and a PowerPoint that you can get across what you're doing, then that's, just a lot easier of a conversation. You can prepare the conversation, but if the company representative is going to drive it, let them drive it. You'll actually learn a lot that way. They'll be asking you the specific questions that will help you to understand exactly what their concerns are. If they're asking about the nature of your technology, then that's the barrier that you need to overcome. They don't think your technology is good enough. If they're asked if they've looked at some of your integrations and they're asking about your flexibility, then that's the barrier that you have to overcome, that they don't think that you're flexible enough to do it the way that they do it. So that's actually the best opportunity that you can get if they engage enough, because you'll learn a lot about not only that company's perspective, but it'll just teach you a little bit more about how to continue developing your product so the next person will be a bit more receptive. Again, even if they're not asking you the right question, they may say thanks but no thanks at the end. But take the time to try to figure out what their perception is of you, because even if it doesn't end in anything, again, it's a learning opportunity for you and your company. I'd also say please read the conversation correctly, and this goes back to not being pushy. If they're not offering next steps, if they're not inviting you to a meeting to meet more of the team or an in-person phone call, then again, as we talked about before, go away and come back when the time is right. In terms of the things that we were venting about when I was doing some research for this with the business development people I know, that was the number one thing, the people who just don't know how to take no for an answer. And I get that when you're talking about the livelihood of your company, it really matters, but you're actually only hurting yourself. The last thing I would say is you should tailor the call to the time that you have and expect about 30 minutes max. So don't say, oh no, we need an hour to go through a whole pitch. Be ready to do it in the time that they have. The most important thing that I want to say is figure out how to do that live demo. As I'll talk about when we get into how to conduct the meeting, literally the most memorable pitches that I've seen as I was thinking about this presentation were the ones where I saw really, really, really awesome live demos, where I saw immediately what the product value was and how it would work for my site. So again, first bullet point of advice for meetings, show off your product. Don't talk around it. If you're not actually showing it to me, I'm going to believe that you don't believe in it, it's not ready, there's something you're trying to hide, you're trying to speak larger than it is. Show it off. You should believe in what you're doing. And if you don't feel quite ready to do that, then take the time to do the development work on it so that when you are approaching somebody, the pitch is going to work because you can show off what you've got. We've talked about using lots of visuals, and the best demos that I saw were demos where it seemed as though the product was live, even actually integrated in my site. I told you about the rapid prototyping tool. The way that they conducted that pitch was they said, tell us about a project you're working on where you're having a hard time. And we gave an example, and they actually kind of walked through with our product managers and our tech people sitting in the room, how might we use this tool to communicate requirements from one to the other, and they literally, created it there. It made it seem like it was the easiest thing in the world that this, very, very highly trained person in that tool was able to do that while we were all just sitting there. Another demo that I remember really well was a content management system where they actually took the time before the meeting to build the homepage of my website in their content management tool. And they, sat and said, okay, tell us some of the activities that your developers or your producers would be doing on the site. Well, we would, change the first story on the page. We'd, rotate these other features. We'd add links beneath, whatever it might be. And they actually went and did those things, and they had a pretty cool interface for it. But, literally everybody was sitting in the room imagining, wow, I could work that way, and it would be so much better than the way that I'm working now. And it got a lot of attention from everybody. And even though in that particular case, I could say the decision was made to build the CMS in-house rather than use a vendor, everybody remembered that vendor, and not that it would make the vendor feel any better, but that, part of that became the standard for, what the internal team was, being held to in terms of designing the interface. In terms of bringing people, don't bring like your entire company of 20 people. it's very hard to have effective conversations that way. You should have a business side person, whether it's the account manager or the product owner, whatever it might be, a tech specialist if based on that previous slide, the level of integration is such that a person like me is going to start peppering with a lot of questions. If you don't answer those questions right away, we're going to assume that you don't really know, so have the tech person there who's ready to answer them. And you can feel free to ask for your counterparts. If you know that you need to have a technical conversation about it, you can say the business development person and who will be there from the tech side. And if they say nobody, then you can ask for someone to be there. They may or may not comply, but you should know which people you want in the room to be able to not only hear your pitch, but understand what you're actually pitching. The business development person, that may be your primary contact, but they may not actually be the ones who can see, wow, we've really got something here. I would not say, and we talked about this before, that it's easy to just try it out. No one's going to believe you on that because too many people have already said that and made that completely unbelievable. And also for the reasons that we talked about before, it's not as easy as you would think for a big company just to try something out. On the site where I'm working on now, some of our platforms are so old. If I told you how long it would take to, drop in a piece of JavaScript and actually get it to integrate, you'd all be vaguely appalled, and that's why we're rebuilding all of them. But, you should know that don't keep insisting it's going to be really easy. And also don't keep saying, like, oh, let's just do a trial, because in the world of a big company, there isn't just a trial. There's too much paperwork, there's too much legal work and time that even gets you to the point where you can actually do a trial. So, for a big company, that's just not realistic. If you're dealing with other small companies, it's a totally different ballgame, and that is a possibility. Again, tailor the meeting to the time that you have, and also, as we spoke about before, make them dream about the possibilities. Have them imagine how they would be using your tool, how users would be engaging with the site, how monetization metrics could be coming up. Paint them a vision of how much better things would be if only they did business with you. Because that's what you want them to leave. A good meeting is one where all of us on the corporate side, after everybody leaves, are kind of chattering, wow, they really got at that problem. They really could address this. Where even if the timing isn't right, we're all remembering your solution. I can name a couple of companies that have pitched to me in iVillage in the short time that I've been there, where again the time isn't necessarily right, but we're going to remember that they had a really cool idea. That when the time is right, we left that room really believing that there was an opportunity there. So be real about the challenge. I would say react to questions, but don't necessarily proactively offer answers to some of these concerns. In other words, you don't want to sort of lay out all your weak spots on the table, but be ready to answer them, because if you don't, again, it's going to show a lack of competence. First of all, the number of people who will be dedicated to the project exclusively. Very important if it's a deep integration. I don't want to know that you have one tech guy and he's going to be dealing with 5 clients, including me. So tell me it's going to take 3 people, and tell me that you're ready to start hiring people and you think it'll take you a few weeks to have them. It's not the ideal answer, but it's honest, and it's only going to get you in trouble later if you're not being honest about it. You should talk about how much traffic that you're seeing and what's your ability to scale. Even if you only have a small amount of traffic, and doing a deal with my site is going to quadruple the amount of traffic that your platform is seeing, let me know that you understand how to scale, that you know exactly what the turnaround time will be for you to either spin up more AWS instances or get additional servers and rack them, whatever it might be. As long as I know that you're going to know how to solve the problem, then it'll make me a little bit less worried about relying on you for that sort of thing. You should have a sense of what the cost and the time frame will be. Again, these are really, really big trust issues. And also you should have a sense of what acceptable business terms are to you. And also when they say to you things like, we don't do ratio shares, for example, or whatever your proposed model might be, have a fallback. You should prepare to be flexible. Again, no big company is going to want to take your product exactly as it is. And I would also say be really careful if you're offering something that's core to the company's business. Back to the build versus buy issue, I would say, build all the time if it's something that's really central to what I'm doing. That example of the CMS we built because if you're a content site, you need to own your CMS in a way that, that if content's only part of what you do, you can get away with. So you should understand if what you're doing is so central that they're going to already be squeamish about working with you. So again, it gets back to the special sauce. If you've done something that's really that special and that amazing, it would say maybe they should take the risk of outsourcing something that's, core to the business. So many might advise you differently on this one. They may say that you should, whitewash the challenges a little bit to get the opportunity and figure it out later. And I'll say, that's not a terrible strategy if you can kind of figure it out later. But I'll say that in all the time that I've been involved in deals, the only time that I actually killed a deal after we already attempted the integration phase and things were going badly. It was a case where there was an incredible mismatch between what the company promised, what kind of flexibility they ensured us they could have so that their integration could work in the particular way that our site worked versus what they were actually able to achieve. It was not only that, what the time and the costs were actually going to be, but the fact that, there was just, that trust was completely broken. There was just a fundamental lack of honesty, even throughout the entire legal process where, point by point, we were, going through what the time and materials would be. So, yeah, you can whitewash these answers and not necessarily err on the side of being completely honest, but someone's going to figure it out later, and if you're not going to be the first one to do that, they'll still, as happened to this one particular deal that I was involved in, they'll still kill it. A signed contract is no guarantee of anything if they believe you're in breach of contract. A little bit about demeanor. All of this is obvious. I would say don't be arrogant. A lot of people come in believing they have the world's best idea and they're going to set the world on fire. Maybe you are a game changer, but don't act like they should already know that you know that, or that they should know that. We talked about being pushy and, again, reasonable flexibility. Don't promise something that you can't deliver. The rest of this, I think is fairly obvious. And if you guys are entrepreneurs going out there and build these things, I don't need to tell you that you have brand love. You've created your idea, you've nurtured it. You better have brand love because that's what you're doing. The last thing in terms of realistic expectations. So here's the tough part. I've tried to offer, lots of, good advice to get yourself noticed, but the reality is that the best is that you're going to get is a phone call, and even that is going to be rare. And getting a meeting out of a cold call is very, very rare. I was sort of hesitant in terms of talking through people to give you what the actual numbers are, but look, the odds are against you. A lot of times just because what you're doing doesn't perfectly align with what the company's strategy is, and it really has nothing to do with you, it's just the company knows where it's going. If you get someone declining, as we talked about, listen to the feedback that you're given. It's a learning opportunity before you pitch the next company. If you're going to follow up later, as we said, reference that feedback. Say, you were concerned that we didn't have enough of a tech team to support it. We've now gotten 5 partnerships, and we've built up our team in the following ways, and does this make a difference? And we talked about being pushy, so I'm not going to belabor the point. So here's the last section, and this is the, but wait, you're all sitting here because you think you want to do this. But do you really want to? Is your business ready? In a lot of cases, it's a lot easier to aim at, more smaller companies than to try to get that one big deal. The low end often beats the high end. And also you need to ask yourself, is that big partnership mandatory for your success? In some cases, if you're not on a major media website, you're not going to achieve the goals of what you're trying to do. And a lot of other cases, that just isn't the case. It may not be the sort of glorious future that you imagine for yourself when you set off on your journey of creating the company, but it is a way of growing into a profitable business, which is, not a terrible thing to get when you're an entrepreneur. For example, if you're a tool that's aggregating content from various sources, it may be that there's just no value if you can't sign partnership deals with the top sites, because no one wants to aggregate content from a bunch of middling blogs. So yeah, you're kind of stuck. You probably need those deals in place. But for most startups, I don't think that that's the case. I do think you can start by setting your sights lower, building up those partnerships and competence so that when the time is right, you can approach the big company. So here is kind of the main point that I kind of want to emphasize to all of you as a friend in this process, because I've been on both sides. I've been on the startup side and I've been on the corporate side, and I've tried to pitch bigger places and haven't succeeded. And I've also seen people pitch us where I kind of want to step outside the conversation and say, wait, you really don't want to do business with us? We're going to eat you alive. So here are the pros, and you guys know this, and that's why you're here and listening to all of this. You do a partnership with a big company, it's going to get you noticed, whether PR or trade press. It's going to look really good for you. It'll make it easier for you to get future deals. All you need to say is you have a partnership with someone like the New York Times, and it's going to get you in other doors. It could provide meaningful revenue or traffic if it performs. I would say watch your expectations here. If you think you're going to be getting a huge amount of traffic from a big website, it isn't always the case. Here's where you can kind of push on the big company and make them be realistic about what they are offering you. And you'll learn by working for the big companies we've spoken about how to grow your feature set by integrating with them, by seeing how they do things, by growing with them as they need you to change things to follow where they're going. You'll learn as well how to grow your product. But here are the cons, and I tried to balance the cons just for the visuals. I know it seems like there are a lot more cons. I mean, the truth is, I think we all know how one big deal has made companies what they are. So forgive the visual that it looks like you should never do business with a big company, because if that's what you guys left here thinking, then I would be in big trouble, because there are a lot of deals that we need to do in the coming months. So first of all, it could be a time sink for you. We talked about integration. It could be a really difficult integration where you're actually altering your out-of-the-box product, and that's not actually what you should be doing when you're in an earlier stage. There could be a lot of costly legal work. The lawyers at a company like NBC, which rolls up to GE, well, maybe not for long, but they will drive you nuts. And there could also be a lot of technology work. All of that could then skew your overall product roadmap. If you're spending all of your time supporting one big client and all the unique things that they're doing, rather than innovating your core product, and you do that too prematurely, then you're really cutting off your growth path. And again, it makes your product too specific rather than, again, figuring out how to make it, broader and more generally applicable, where, again, you could get a quantity of partners rather than maybe the top quality partners. It also might mean that you have to raise your costs too much too soon. If, the integration suddenly means that you need to hire 5 developers just to do this one integration, you're suddenly spending a lot of money where you may or may not recoup that, and it may be too much of a risk for you to take early on. And finally, if you don't deliver, this may be a little too intense, your reputation is shot. It really depends how you don't deliver. But, the world is pretty small. If you pitch to some other big company, it'll get around that you tried to do this integration with someone else and it didn't work. So again, do the integration when you're ready and you know that it's going to succeed. So, in general, the advice that I would give to all of you today, more than any of the specific ideas, is work your way up before you approach, a big company, or before you even do your first partnership, if that's where you are. Have a track record with your smaller sites, or if you don't even have smaller sites, have your product ready, and have a stable product with proven success, or at least a stable product where when you're doing the integrating, it's not now a disaster that you have to change 5 partners along the way. As we discussed back in the beginning, the more numerous your existing partnerships, the more that a big company is going to take a chance on you. And, it's easier to learn about these things when the stakes are lower. It's easier to make mistakes and get away with them when the stakes are lower. So I'm not trying to dissuade you. I think, all of you guys, I'm impressed. Not on the entrepreneurial side, but for all of you who are trying to do it. It's not to dash your dreams. It's just trying to provide advice for you to know when is the right time and how to set up the right growth path for a company. So that's what I've got. I will just close by saying I hope I provided some good food for thought. It's hard work. It's true the odds are tough. But the good news is a lot of these things that I've spoken about, I think, should align a lot with the considerations that you've had in terms of creating your own company. So I want to wish you all the best of luck. I know it's tough, but I hope to be doing business with some of you in the near future, if not the longer term. So thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Before we move on now to the Q&A, I just want to give first off a big thank you to Tammy Hepps, our gracious speaker, who has just given a wealth of information in a fairly short amount of time. I also want to thank our host for this evening, Sun Microsystems. This space is working out great, as well as our sponsors, VORC, the Enterprise Framework for PHP, as well as Microsoft's Windows 7. And now I'd like to open the floor up for questions. Yes.
What do you think about ease of integration? Is it very big key for the product, for the vendor?
It sort of depends where it maps to other things. If your product is just that good, it's worth the effort to do that integration to get that benefit, then yeah, if it's a costly or more in-depth integration, then that's fine. But if it's something where you're providing something a lot simpler, you should think about what's the simplest way that you can package it so that they can get the work done. You don't want the reason that they don't do work with you to say, oh, we don't have the time or the developers to actually get that thing to work. Because you'd be amazed at the length of a product backlog at some of these companies. You'd be astonished actually. And so you don't want to get yourself stuck in the queue where you keep getting turned aside just because they can't get enough resources to literally do that work with you. So I would say that it's pretty key to figure out, and even if the earliest stages that you're conceptualizing your product, if it's a product that's meant for delivery in that kind of way, know how it is that you're going to be packaging it and delivering it. It's a key consideration if making a partnership is the way that the product is going to be successful. So to me, it's a fundamental concern when you're developing it, not something you think about later when it's too late.
In the back.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the type of data mining solutions that you're interested in?
Yes, ask questions of the person to see what you can find out. Fair. I may not be the best person, if I had, analytics people here, I would turn to them and say, tell me. I would say, in general, a site like iVillage, for example, which has a really large community, this trend is everywhere, not just within iVillage, but, not only do we want to know what people are talking about, but we want to know what their sentiments are. So, they're talking about natural language processing or something like that. But I'd love for people to be able to say, like, wow, people on our message boards are talking a lot about detergent. Maybe we should sell Tide. Like, you should sell into our message boards because people are already talking about detergent and they're not talking about your detergents. So that's one place where we're really sort of looking at opportunities to figure out, to learn about our community rather than what's happened in the past, just watching it. But in general, across the board, and the site that I'm at now is no different from any other site that I've worked at. It's just that we have a lot more tools and expertise now than we did 5 or 6 years ago when I first started being a part of these conversations. But, gathering data that the users give you as well as that you can, explicitly intuit from what they're doing, what the actions are on the site, what people are visiting, where are they going to from where, what are they telling you? We were, having a conversation earlier today where we were joking about whether or not you're pregnant and if you are, when you're due should be a mandatory field or not in your iVillage profile, since it's a site for women and becoming a mother is such a big issue for our community. So not figuring out which women of the world are pregnant necessarily, but figuring out how you can kind of find out those data points about users, because when you're talking about increasing engagement or addressing the audience better, the more that we can know about what they're doing is probably for us the biggest issue. Whether it's getting the full picture about individual users, or whether it's just getting the full picture about what the users in aggregate are doing.
You implied a number of times in your talk that you're very open to, you're hoping to do deals over the next few months with a lot of folks, and I'm imagining that iVillage isn't that different from the web media world at large. Is there some sort of trend relating to economics or to the environment that we're in such that the media world is at this particular time more open than they have been to doing partnering, or is it just unique to your circumstance?
Well, let me tell you how iVillage arrived at this point, because I think it might actually get at why maybe a bunch of websites are arriving at this point. So iVillage has been around since 1995. Some of the technology that I'm in the process of rebuilding shows it, or near to. So, there was an article in the New York Times business section shortly before I started where my boss and my boss's boss were talking about their plans for redoing the entire iVillage website from the technology on up. And so, part of it is because the platforms are just so old that they're inhibiting our ability to do business rather than, helping it along. And also because we're sort of at a point where we realize to do the best that we can with our audience, we really need a much more enriched, content experience, a much, much better community experience. I mean, community online has come a long way from when a lot of the tools that we have on the site now were rolled out. So, based on, the age of the site and its technology and sort of the age of, the business model and, just the incredible speed at which things have been changing in recent years around online community websites, that's why for us we reached a point where we wanted to do really big sweeping things, and every single of the deals that we're looking to do fit within building out that new experience, whether it's a platform that enables a certain level of interactivity on the site or kind of content that's going to augment our offerings. So that's the story with iVillage. So you can, iVillage is one of the older websites, but you could say that probably a lot of the big media websites, roughly, got online between let's say 95, 98, 99. So, you're talking about sites that are, 10 to 15 years old, and I don't really know, but maybe a lot of them are kind of reaching that inflection point where, whether it's old technology or, having waited a little bit too long to do that next revamp, or, moving to the next level, and now the web is just such a different place that unless you add in the social networking, the community, the Twitter integrations, all of those kinds of things, you're just not even a player anymore. That may be why a bunch of sites are reaching that point. A site like the Times, which, maybe I can speak a bit more freely about because it's been a while now since I've been there. But, great site, still mostly a content experience. How much longer is just a content experience going to be enough on a site like that? For many years, when I was there, we would, talk about how much we wanted to do with community or personalization, and a lot was done. But now it's not like a nice to have. It makes us look cool. It's mandatory if you want to compete. So those may be the forces at play in what you're seeing.
Questions? Oh, lots of hands just going all the way in the back.
Tammy, by the way, I really enjoyed the presentation.
Oh, thank you.
One note, if there's any way, can I get a copy of the PowerPoint?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We're going to post that up afterwards. It'll all go out to everyone in their email.
Glad you found it useful.
Oh, that was the whole question?
That was it.
All right. Right there.
Hi, what lessons were learned from the failure of the iVillage television show that was on NBC?
I couldn't really tell you for two reasons. Number one, I didn't know about it when it happened. In fact, the friend who told me about it is sitting in this room. That, in fact, when I interviewed, I didn't know. And when I sat down with, in fact, the CTO of all of NBC, and he said, well, what do you think are the synergy opportunities? I very stupidly said, we should have an iVillage TV show. And he looked at me like I was an idiot naturally, because clearly I had not done enough research. So what lessons were learned? That the obvious things are not always so obvious. One would say it's a total no-brainer that, you should have an iVillage TV show. Part of it was the model with which they rolled it out, and again, my friend who told me about this in the first place is much more an expert in the cable space and could tell you exactly why it didn't work, but I'm not going to point him out and make him do that. But part of it is because certain things in NBC that are in place now weren't in place then. For example, we own Oxygen now. In fact, iVillage shares space with Oxygen. So there is, in fact, probably a much better way to have an iVillage TV show where you're not trying to convince various networks to put it up there, but you put it on Oxygen and you give it some spin. I don't know, like the Bad Girls of iVillage, or I don't know what, but or Top Chefs of iVillage. I don't know, but figure out something where now they actually have a destination for it. There's a better possibility. But I'll tell you honestly, I'm not a TV person. Obviously, I didn't even know about it when I was interviewing for the job. So beyond those kind of high-level things, I don't know that I could give you anything more specific.
Well, it was very interactive with the website, and I found it to be very different from the normal television shows in the morning.
So from your experience, was it too cutting edge? Did you suppose you had to be in front of your computer?
Some of the moms just were not modern enough. Maybe that was why it didn't work. But I was just curious.
I'd love to say that iVillage was too cutting edge. I don't know enough to know if that was the case, but we talk a lot about when we're looking at the traffic on our websites, the throws that we get from television. We have a diet website that when they do the throw from, I think it's the Biggest Loser, we know that the traffic's going to spike. We need to be ready for it. So, they weren't doing those kinds of things in the past, or if they were, you weren't actually seeing, measurable traffic difference in people getting online. So maybe now's the time where enough people are, literally sitting there with iPhones in hand and could kind of take the actions and check the content. But based on when I believe they did this TV show, I think it was shortly after the acquisition, so probably about a few years ago, most people weren't at that point then.
All the way in the third back.
I have a two-part question.
Sure.
The first is, when you're looking at a new pitch, what are some of the compelling factors that lead you to either build it in-house or actually partner? And secondly, are NDAs basically a non-starter?
So I'll take the second part first, which is if one of my BD friends were here, in fact, the guy who sits next to me in my office, he would say, yes, NDAs are non-starters. If you're pitching to us, you should be ready to talk about what you're doing. Mostly it's just because for us, the legal work can get involved and take time. And if all we're doing is something exploratory, it's probably not worth that time. But yeah, you need to think about if it's a total non-starter for you to go out with your ideas. A, first of all, are you actually at the point where you're ready to be talking about it? And B, if it is the issue, then figure out some way to do your pitch so that they actually really, really, really want to see what you're offering, and it's worth the trouble of doing the NDA. In terms of the first question about what jumped out at me, I believe that was the first part.
Or what are some compelling factors to either partner or just take the idea and build it in-house?
Oh, right, the build versus buy. I would say I'm probably, if anybody's sitting in a room, the toughest person on build versus buy. My background is as a software developer, writing, software and open source platforms. So my bias, like many people who kind of came of age in technology when I did, is we can build it all, we can do it all, we shouldn't have to pay for anything. So I would say I'm probably one of the hardest people to convince. First of all, if you're doing something that is really complicated and I don't want to build myself, For example, I did write a search engine from scratch when I was a software developer, and I don't really know why we did that, but we did. We did. But if you're offering search now, it probably has that quote-unquote secret sauce, which in this case is just too damn hard a problem for me to waste time solving. In most cases, for a content website, for example, they just want search to work. They don't want to spend the time coming up with like the world's best search algorithm to make it better, because I won't say search is a solved problem, but it's solved well enough. No one's going to try to recreate the wheel on that, or if they are, they're going to be in their own company doing that. So search is a great example of sort of the set of problems that are just so complicated. But also the set of problems that are just not interesting to me. User management systems, for example, I have like a CRM tool. It's sort of a necessary evil. In some ways it's core because managing our community is so core to what we do. But on the other hand, like of all the things that I want to do to enhance the product, I don't really want to spend a lot of time spending building, let's say, the world's best CRM tool, because although there is a measurable impact, it's not quite on the front end of the site. So if you're building a technology that's something that's that's much more on the back end, that has less of a visual impact, it probably makes it a little bit easier for you. Again, if it's something that's too hard or too time consuming for me and my team to build. So in terms of when you're sort of trying to overcome that build versus buy barrier, it's the amount of time that it would take me to recreate it, the skill sets that would be required to recreate it. Something we were brainstorming about earlier this week, we were joking that we need 6 MIT PhDs to be able to build it. So you go and find those 6 MIT PhDs and build the amazing product, because great, I don't have the time to do that or oversee it. So complexity of time, costs. And again, if you're not core, it's a lot easier to just sidestep that issue altogether, because if it's not core, it's very easy for me to say I don't want to solve that problem.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
He stole it from you, but why don't you guys find it out?
In general, as from a security, privacy, compliance standpoint, how important are those things to you? Can you rank them in choosing a vendor? I know it's a general question.
It's funny, I'm smiling because I'll tell you my answer, and then I will tell you GE's answer, and they're on the opposite ends of the spectrum. My answer is, it depends what you're doing. It's a level to which I matter, and I tend to be a little bit more liberal than most people are on that, or a little bit more willing to take a risk on that. I don't think a lot of other CTOs would necessarily say that, so take my view as an outlier, but. It depends what you're doing, basically. If you're actually running my user management system, okay, that's very different from, a widget where you're passing through, data that's not actually, specific to any particular user. But, I'll say when you start getting in the contract process with a big company like the one that I'm in currently, suddenly, GE security standards apply, and they are crazy rigorous. You'd think that, you were coming to me not to provide a widget, but a nuclear submarine based on, some of the clauses that you see in there. So, a big company is likely to come at you with those kinds of things, where even if it's the inclination of the sort of immediate people to give you a bit more space and flexibility on that, we don't necessarily have a choice, because their rules and their standards in a much bigger company. They can't end up with egg on their faces because you let their data go. So, I guess the end result is you should take it very seriously, because even if someone like me doesn't, somebody will force them to.
Since he stole it from you.
So I guess it's a little more obvious for a startup that wants that attention, that big deal. I operate a more mature bootstrapped startup, and we're not really looking for that big deal. We're not actively looking for it, but should we be for long-term sustainability?
I don't know. It depends what you're doing. I gave a lot of reasons at the end to say why you shouldn't try to go down this road, because it could be a lot of effort and not necessarily pan out. It really depends. You see there are a lot of, some of the most successful startups are the ones that you don't hear about, because they're not like the Twitters where everyone's using it but they have no idea how they're going to make a penny at the end of the day. If you're not out for that prestige, but you're out for the really solid business that's going to generate solid revenues and has a solid growth path, then I would say for you, maybe you really don't want to do this. And again, if you have a really good thing going with predictable growth numbers and that sort of thing, it's worth pitching to try to begin to learn what it might take to do an integration with a bigger site for what you're doing. But it may be that it just completely changes your model. If you need to have 5 people dedicated to setting up one integration, that may totally spoil what's good about the way that you work. So, just some considerations there. But you seem like you're happy with where you are, and clearly, you've you've done the soul searching that I sort of asked people to do in those last few slides of what do you really need to do to grow your business, and if what you figured out is, you have a solid thing going, there are plenty of people who need what you're doing, then, I wouldn't feel the pressure, unless of course you want to, see your name in lights and, have all the, New York Times articles about your company, then, that's a different issue, and then I would talk to you about hubris, but different conversation.
I'd like to just burrow in a little bit more on that build versus buy issue.
Sure.
Could there be other issues involved, for instance, that, say you developed a complicated middleware software product and your company doesn't want to feel that licensing it would be too onerous, or, there could be ego factors involved here where
Sure.
where people say, well, look, if we give it to this other company, that's going to diminish our rank, our prestige, our self-esteem in the company. I'm trying not to give you the answers, but I'm trying to suggest the direction that I'd like you to pursue a little bit further.
Well, I got confused by your last part about not giving the answers. I can tell you.
The thing is, does licensing, the fact that you might have to license a middleware product, give a larger company pause because they're not completely in control of it. The license may not be something that is as advantageous to them as if they built it in-house.
Oh, it is completely the control issue. In the case of what we're looking at right now, we're literally figuring out, how do we want to do registration and authentication. And, we want to own our user data. It's a big issue. We don't want to have someone else running that system. You never know what can happen, and it's one thing when you screw it up, and it's another thing when a vendor that you can't find on the telephone screws it up. So there is a major issue of control, and it, depends what you're looking at, whether you're looking at a team that, in the case of the team that I'm overseeing now, is capable of developing it and overseeing it and supporting it in the right way. But, I've been asked to step in to lead other teams where the team wasn't actually there with that level of maturity. And so actually what I want to do is entrust it to somebody whose business is to do it right. Because I don't want to entrust it to a team that isn't mature enough to be able to do it, or, as we were talking about before, isn't core enough. So it's not a non-starter, and also, as I said before, exposing my biases, I tend to be a lot more on the build side. But there are plenty of places where what they want to do is buy a lot of sort of really solid, proven components and have smart people put them together into a website that works really effectively. Or what they want to do is focus on customizing the front end and have, reliable components on the back end. Again, not my particular bias, but you'll run into plenty of companies where that's the strategy they want to follow, and if this is what you're doing, then you'll have likelier chances of success there, because you'll be talking to a technical person who has preconceived notions about what works that are in line with the model that you're proposing. But someone like me would probably be a little bit tougher just because of my biases.
Given what you said about the herd mentality,
Yeah.
Can you speak a little more about trying to land an anchor partnership, especially with regards to like a mature kind of startup role? Let's talk about like what you mentioned about recommendations. Like, would a company like iVillage really look at a new startup in the recommendation space when there's 5 or 6 that are out there?
Sure. I can answer freely because we aren't looking at any recommendation engines right now. But if we were, it would be a little bit harder to answer you. It would come down to, a bunch of other factors. If the developers are all, ex-Google people who are experts in, content, then yeah, I want to hear, like, why do they leave Google to found a startup to be expert in this kind of thing? So, in the case of recommendation engine, there's a real possibility there for that one. Can you remember the first part of your question?
Oh yeah, no, it was just about landing an anchor partner.
Oh, the anchor partner, thanks.
Yeah.
Right, so, for you to say, watch, our stuff in action on, major, insert name a major media company here is a big deal. But again, there's always the what's in it for me. I know what's in it for you. If you're going to do it in a better way, and that means being sort of really, really solid on a lot of these things that I outlined, if you're going to be really solid on all of them, then it may be worth taking the risk. But, if you're embedded in every single one of my pages, in a meeting, I'm going to hammer you on technical points that you may or not be ready to answer. The editorial people are going to want to see it in action. They're going to force you to do more of a demo than you may necessarily want to invest the time and energy to do. So that, it's one thing for you to say, like, oh, here's our PowerPoint where we use the algorithm on the back end and it spit out these results. Sure. They'll want to be able to see it in action, maybe actually deliver you a dump of the database and make you show the way it's going to work. You'll have to jump through a few more hoops. Whether iVillage would actually do that, it's hard for me to say. I'm there 3 months. I'm only beginning to know the biases of the people that I'm working with, and honestly, they're only beginning to know mine. So, I wouldn't rule it out, but yeah, for, the same reason why I talked about the herd mentality, it's going to be tough. If I can see, a known product on somebody else's website and it works well enough, and I can talk to my friend who works at other companies, say, yeah, they're mostly supportive. They mostly make the changes we need. It's never really been down. Again, it'll make it a little bit harder for you because there's sort of known quantity versus unknown quantity.
There was a hand right there, right? Right there.
What do you consider core from your perspective when you decide build versus buy? When I think of iVillage, I think of a content site.
Right. So content management system I think is something as potentially core. It's what our editors are using day in, day out. We are using an open source possibility and option and customizing it for our needs, but we started there. So we're not building a CMS from scratch, and like building a search engine from scratch. A lot of people would be a fool for some of these kinds of things, which are so mature now to go and build it from scratch. Unless, of course, you're a company that's doing that, which is a different story from a company like mine where it's a means to an end. So a content management system is one thing. In our case, community is really core to what we're doing. It's also a case where we're using a vendor, and it's just because it's so complicated. It's a problem that we don't necessarily want to solve. It's core to what we're doing, but we want to own the management of the community versus the building of the tools. But if you look at our community strategy going down the road, we're not building everything. There's certain cases where what we're doing is so specific to the way that our platform works that, like user-generated content, for example, there's no reason to bring in somebody else's user-generated content tool. It's only going to cause more problems when we need to figure out some way of rolling up all of your different kinds of submissions into your profile, which we're building. So in that sense, what we're doing is so particular that a framework that does it probably isn't even going to fit technologically. And even if it does, just is going to make everything else harder to actually do what we want to do. Because in a lot of these cases, even in the case where a company is going out and looking for a vendor, like the mocks are done at the same time that they're looking at the vendors. So by the time, the pieces go together, like the vendor's like, here, make this happen. And the vendor looks at the mocks and says, this is really great. This has nothing to do with the way our model works. And you know that because we showed you integrate on other sites. Different issue, and you should be lucky to get far enough along to have that problem. But there are preconceived notions for a lot of these things. When I know that the preconceived notions are such that there's absolutely no way of fitting it in, I'm not even going to try. When it comes to content is really core, but we're also really realistic about what we can produce and what we can't. We're not going to be writing, medically vetted articles about, diseases that children could have between the ages of 1 and 3. Not that that's a tech startup, but, it's a case where it just doesn't make enough sense for us to do. In terms of, because a lot of people are asking this question about what's core and what's not core, I would talk to other people to sort of get that perspective. Again, I think I draw the line a little bit different from where other people might. But, I don't want to solve the problem of search. I don't want to solve the problem of a recommendation engine because I don't think I can do that one better either. I probably want to own my user data. I probably want to own the content on the site. I don't want to own analytics. I really don't want to own analytics. I probably don't want to own anything about the ad serving unless I'm trying to do something super, super, super customized there. And even now I would say, a lot of the ad technologies have come a long way such that, the line that I might have drawn a few years back is actually very different from where it is now. So that's where I fall out on a few of those. But I would say, talk to people to get a sense of where they would draw the build versus buy line.
We got last question basically. Time for one more.
Provide any advice. I just want to say you're a great speaker.
Thank you.
We're really entertained out here.
Oh, good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
But this is just kind of like an advice for other entrepreneurs out there. I tried to pitch to a big company, told them I was an entrepreneur. They hung up the phone on me, called back and said, I'm a business student and I'm trying to do this research project. And they're like, we don't work with business students. And they hung up with me again. And then I lied and said I was an advertiser. And they're like, let's set up a meeting. Just so you know, there's several ways to get around the system. So, that essentially got me working with the deal with the
Look, it's true. You tried, all the right things and even things that are in line with, what I'm suggesting because, at the end of the day, honesty is the best policy. But, it depends what you want. If you just, like I said, want to be educated in the way the company's doing things, then yeah, you're absolutely right. Get in the door to have a conversation. And look, your advertiser thing worked because you got right to the heart of the matter, which is money.
Absolutely. I said the client actually passed, but I have something else I'm working with. And they didn't remember that I was an advertiser in the beginning, so
Right, because I don't have enough time to pay attention.
A little trick that I did.
Yeah, look, I mean, as I said before, whitewashing, figuring out the way to spin it, all completely legitimate. You just somehow need to make your story sew up in the end if they remember the details along the way.
That was great. We got time actually for one more now. So.
Do you Google, Twitter, or Facebook the people that you're interested in?
That I'm reaching out to or that are reaching out to me?
If somebody was to catch your eye and you thought they were interested, how much do you use the social media to look them up?
I'll always try to look up on LinkedIn. It's interesting to me to know what a person's trajectory is and what their background is. Have they worked at big sites so they know what I'm dealing with, or are they, running from startup to startup to startup where maybe they don't have enough of, enough knowledge in one place or another. I'm not a huge fan of Twitter. I'm probably the only person in the room who doesn't obsessively use Twitter, so again, outlier.
Oh, you're not.
Thank you. I've been yelled at by various people that a person in my position needs to be obsessively on Twitter, but time issues. But yeah, it's always interesting to see, when a person's on Twitter. You get a sense of who they are as a person, not always who they are as a business person, which is why it's not always relevant to what I'm doing. Some people use Twitter as a way of, saying, here I am, and here are all the big entrepreneurial thoughts that I'm thinking all the time about the internet, and those are sort of interesting. And then other people, it's like they're at the supermarket with their kid who's throwing up, like I don't care. So sometimes there's value in that. LinkedIn is where I'll start. Also, if it's a person who I think has a bit more experience, I might Google just to see what press releases were written about, things that they might have done. If they've spoken places, been recognized places where they, asked to be an expert in a column, all that's sort of interesting. But for someone like me, I kind of want to meet you and be impressed with you in person. You meet a lot of people with amazing resumes who are very less than amazing in person. And you meet a lot of people who have, the kinds of resumes that you wouldn't even necessarily look twice at, who, totally have all the skills. They get the way that things work. They have a really sharp mind about where the internet is going, and that you would not get from anywhere else other than meeting the person. I mean, I'll say for myself, when I started out hiring, I was like, great, I only want people from name brand schools. I only want people with the following degrees. And, some of the best people that I've hired were people who were not necessarily from name brand schools. Some of whom didn't even have degrees. One of the best developers that I ever worked with went to art school and didn't complete it. Here's somebody who just got the way that code worked. And so, that's hiring a completely different issue. How to get hired by a big company is maybe a different presentation. But, for me, that's the way I try to assess people because, brands on a resume, yeah, as we talked about before, it gets you in a door, but it's not going to seal the deal unless you can back it up.
Thank you. You're great.
Thanks.
I want to thank you all for coming. Tammy will be up here. If you want to ask any more questions, feel free to come up. And thank you all. See you.